Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our final video in our series of what is stereotyping. So in the first video, we talked about what stereotyping is and what function it serves for us as humans. And in the second one, I talked about some harms of stereotyping. In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about one aspect of the harm of stereotyping, which is stereotype threat. And stereotype threat is a theory that was developed by a Stanford researcher by the name of Claude Steele. And essentially what stereotype threat says is that it is the fear of being in a situation or doing something for which a negative stereotype about one's group applies. And so what this is sort of activating is this is activating that fourth harm that we talked about, which is the self-fulfilling prophecy. Essentially what this says is that if a person is exposed to a situation where there is the possibility that a negative stereotype about them or a group that they belong to could be activated, oftentimes people of that group will start to actually behave in the way that the stereotype says that they would. So let's take a look at what this looks like. One of the really interesting things about Claude Steele's work is that it has been replicated over and over and over again with different groups. And so it's not necessarily just that stereotype threat gets activated in one group, it's that stereotype threat gets activated essentially in anybody who gets exposed to the possibility of a negative stereotype about their group. Two different studies I'd like to bring up, specifically looking at stereotype threat, was one was they had two groups, and this was testing sort of stereotype threat of the proficiency of mathematics in women. So essentially, this was going to see if we could activate the stereotype threat of women not being as good at math or science, engineering, technology, so the STEM fields, as they're not as good at them as men are. So essentially, they divided their participants into two groups. In group A, they had co-ed, so it was men and women who were taking the exact same math test. And then in group B, it was women only, and they were taking the exact same test as group A was. They just weren't with men. And the hypothesis of this was that because there is the perception that women are not as good at math, that the women who were in the co-ed group would actually perform worse than the men would. And what they found was really interesting was, first of all, that hypothesis was proven that in that group that was co-ed, the women did indeed perform worse than the men on the test, and they performed just worse overall average. In the other group, though, there was something that really interesting happened, which was that not only did they perform better than the women in the co-ed group, but they actually performed the best of any group. They actually performed better than the men in any other demographic. And so what this showed was that this group that was sort of put in a situation where the negative stereotype could be perceived, they started actually performing in that way. So their test scores actually went down. The second one, same thing, sort of in a classroom setting, was to show sort of how racial racial stereotypes could be activated as well. So done in a college classroom, they had black and white male athletes who were put together to take a test. And so they had two groups of both black and white male athletes in these two different experimental groups. And in the first group, they were given a test, and they were told in the directions that this test was going to be a skill of athletic aptitude. So essentially, this was going to be a test of how athletic you were. In the second group, they were given the exact same test, but the directions were slightly changed. And so instead of being told this was a test of athletic aptitude, they were told that this was a test of strategic aptitude within athletics. So while this one was testing natural athletic ability or athletic ability, this one was testing intelligence around athletics. What the hypothesis was that in this group, the negative stereotype that would be activated based upon athletics, the negative stereotype that would be activated would actually be in the white participants, that white participants are not going to be as naturally athletic as the black participants. In this group, in group B, there was the negative stereotype that was hypothesized to be activated would be that black people aren't as smart as white people. And sure enough, what they found was that in this test, with Group A, when it was testing athletic ability, it was the Black participants did better. In this test, where they were testing strategic knowledge, the white participants did better, even though they were identical tests. And so even something like that, with the framing of that information, created a stereotype threat. So in this way, as I've mentioned throughout each of the videos, stereotyping, even if it seems like it could be positive or negative, it can become incredibly harmful. And since this is sort of the first in the series, the reason why I do stereotyping before I do racism or prejudice or anything else like white privilege or intersectionality or any of these other terms we're going to be exploring is that oftentimes the root of our perceptions are rooted in stereotypes. How do we break them? Well, this is about carving out those new channels. It's about creating new neural pathways. But one of the ways to think about neural pathways is it's sort of like canyons, right? So if you think about the Grand Canyon, that is where water has continuously run in that same sort of direction for millions of years. And neural pathways work very similarly. We have very well-born neural pathways that we send our information down, which means cutting these new pathways. How do we do that? There's a couple of ways we can do this. On an individual level, we can practice a lot better empathic communication. So what is empathic communication? Well, it means being able to put ourselves in that position of the other. And what this also means is being able to check our ego and our assumptions about things like reality and culture at the door. Just because we don't experience or perceive something to be in a certain way does not mean it's not true for somebody else. So rather than going into a situation and going, oh, well, this person looks like they belong to this group, so I can make these assumptions about them, it's about going into interactions assumption-free, especially identifying sort of what areas do you have or what groups of people do you have sort of maybe these deep-rooted stereotypes and how you can start to neutralize those. So talking to people from that group or that culture and listening to their experience of the world. In addition, you can also do some self-directed learning. So consuming media that has been created by groups that represent themselves, right? So for example, this is exactly sort of what this is going to be doing here with this film series of exploring sort of these themes from the lens of the Black experience. And with this, we can, again, do that sort of empathic understanding and empathic listening of putting yourself in that position and understanding sort of how these situations can create different realities for each of us. In the next series of videos that I'm going to do, I'm going to be talking about prejudice and racism and breaking down each of the different kinds of racism. So we're definitely going to be getting into sort of the crux of, well, I'm not racist, and that might be true, but there's a lot of ways that even if you're not racist, you benefit from racist policies, racist practices, and the sort of systemic, institutionalized, and interpersonal racism that is woven into the fabric of this country. All right, thank you all so much for listening. Again, if you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you so much, and stay tuned for the next series of videos.